All right. And then I'm going to go ahead and kick us off for this afternoon. Yeah? All right, terrific. So, welcome everyone to the August session of the DC-AAPOR Book Club 2.0. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the DC-AAPOR YouTube channel after our time together today. So, today's meeting is with Michael Bailey, author of Polling at a Crossroads, Rethinking Modern Survey Research. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Melissa Sedade, your host for this session. The Book Club 2.0 series is brought to you by your DC-AAPOR program committee. And for those unfamiliar with the series, the format is pretty simple. First, the author will present on the background about the book, including highlights and insights. During this part, please mute your microphones and use the chat feature in Zoom to enter thoughts and questions. Then we'll open up the floor for discussion, starting with items from the chat box and then more generally. If you're comfortable, please feel free to turn on your camera and ask questions or provide feedback directly at that time. You're also invited to contribute reactions and comments to each other, as this is a discussion and not solely a Q&A session. At the end of the hour, I'll announce the name of the DCA-POR member who's won a copy of today's book. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest. Michael A. Bailey is the Colonel William J. Walsh Professor of American Government in the Department of Government and McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. He teaches and conducts research on American politics and political economy. He's published widely on surveys, Congress, and the Supreme Court. His latest book, Polling at a Crossroads, Rethinking Modern Survey Research, is from Cambridge University Press. Other publications include two statistics textbooks, one on political and policy statistics and one on econometrics. He's also a co-author with Forrest Maltzman of The Constrained Court, Law, Politics, and the Decisions Justices Make, and that's from Princeton University Press. Thank you so much for joining us today, and you go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you, Melissa, and thank you, DC-AAPOR, for hosting this talk. So let me share my screen. Wait, did that work? Um, yeah, so, it's exciting and probably a little scary that pollsters are in the news so much. I suspect you, like me, have heard the phrase, if polls are right, more often than you would have thought, right, in the last few weeks. And so what my book is try to step back and attempt to push the field forward to like help us answer that question a little better, right? I think we can do a better job of answering, if polls are right. And so there's two themes. And so the first theme is that random sampling, which of course is the workhorse of modern polling, but random sampling is basically dead, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that the theory is wrong in any way, but it's just not what we do. It just isn't, right? And I'll talk more about that. But the implication of that is because we do not have random samples, I think we should stop talking about our surveys as if they're random samples. And in fact, there is a way to talk about surveys that are non-random samples, right? There's a a set of logic and equations and so forth. So it's not that that we have to talk about random samples in this anachronistic way, but I think we just have to move, kind of get used to talking about surveys in a little more realistic way. That's the first theme. The second theme is then, okay, well, what do we do about it? So, random sampling was great. It's amazing, right? But what do we do in this context? How do we diagnose and deal with some of the problems we have? And I think all too often people say, well, boy, it's just a tough problem. Polls could be wrong, right? And that'll at some level always be true. But there's actually a fair bit we can do. We can write down, here's what I think the problem would be. And if that's the problem, here's a model that would address that problem and the assumptions. We're not going to get away from assumptions, but here's the model and the assumptions that would, help us address that problem. And it turns out we're also going to need different data and do some different methods, but they're not infeasible. They're not like things that are impossible to do, but it's just we're going to have to think differently and then also appreciate the limits of this new way of thinking. But I just think we want to push forward as hard as we can, that there are, in fact, things we can do in this post non-random sampling world to address some of the problems that arise in the post non-random sampling world. Okay, so what I want to do is, before I start, I do want to just define a term. I suspect I know this is a very sophisticated polling audience, and I suspect you're familiar with the term non-ignorable non-response, but I'm going to use that a lot. And that is just when there's non-response, such that even when we account for demographics, race, gender, state, etc., the type of people who respond are different than the type of people who don't respond, right? So there's non-response issues. Some subset of those non-response can be explained by differences in demographics. I'm going to focus on this next level, which even when you account for demographics, there is the kind of people who in any given demographic category who respond may be different than the people who don't respond. So it's non-ignorable non-response. Okay, so that's definition, and then a story, and then I'll get to the meat of the book. So here's a story. It's a story I suspect many of you are familiar with, or at least the broad contours. So, and there's many examples of this, right? So in 2020, the American National Election Study, right, one of the best, they did a survey and they came out and they had Biden up by 11. Biden won by around 4. It's a pretty big miss. There's a big difference between Biden winning by 11 and him winning by 4. And in fact, he won by 4 and just barely won the Electoral College, right? So it's a politically relevant miss. So now let's look at that data a little bit. So in that survey of the respondents, one of the questions that they asked them was, how interested are you in politics? And so folks who were not at all interested in politics or not very interested in politics, Biden and Trump were very close. And that's roughly, looks like pretty much the results that we were, in fact, what we saw. Of the people who are somewhat interested in politics, Biden opens up a pretty nice lead, right? And then the people very interested in politics, what do you think? Biden has a gargantuan lead. And now, as like a layperson, I show this to different kinds of audiences, and they like immediately appreciate, well, man, that survey, those very interested people, that's kind of unusual. And the survey, this is an hour-long survey or whatever it is, 100 plus questions, it's a long survey, probably got more of the very interested people. And those people are running really hot for Biden. So it would make sense that this survey would run hot for Biden. And the thing is, like, this isn't shocking to, polling community, and people have been around polling a lot, but this is not something that the current tools handle, right? We would wait, right? We try to weight our way around non-response, but we can't wait on interest, right? Because we don't have a benchmark, a national benchmark. And by the way, the benchmark would move day to day, right? It's a moving target. Like, just yesterday to today, there's probably different interest in politics, for example, based on the debate. So the current paradigm, of just kind of like pretend it's random sampling and then wait our way to get close as we can, right? We just see it's failing here, and failing in a way that is fairly clear to a lot of different audiences. And so what I'm trying to do is to say, okay, well, let's do more, right? Let's do better than just waiting. Waiting's great, right? But I think we need to do more, right? Okay, so that's kind of my story, like just as a background starting point. And now, like the book, there's 4 sections that I want to talk about today. So one is just a history. So I do a fair bit of discussing the history in the book, just kind of how we got here. And then talk about where we are, right, in the current status quo of what's happening in polling. And then where next. And that's both of these things are really kind of the heart of what the book is about, is to really like try to be as clear-eyed as possible about where we are, and it's not kind of where we say we are, I think. And then the where next, I think there's more. I don't think the full field is really internalized that we can do some things. We're not perfect, right? There's going to be assumptions and everything else, but we're not helpless either. And then I'll give an example of how this kind of thinking can lead to some different conclusions. But I'm not like, it's a work in progress. It's an agenda in progress. And so this is just give you a flavor, kind of a proof of concept. But really more broadly, what I'm trying to do in the book is just a call for this type of stuff. And we're going to have to do lots of experimenting and so forth. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about how do we get here, right? So, for DC-AAPOR members, I suspect all are familiar with the Literary Digest poll. So that was a poll that, had early part of the 20th century. And in the 1936, very famously, they sent out, I think, 10 million ballots. They got 2.4 million ballots back. Right. So the sample size, that is insane. Like we even today have never seen anything like it. Right. And imagine how they did that then. And then famously, they predicted that the Republican Alf Landon would win in a landslide. And then, of course, as we all know in the story, that Franklin Delano Roosevelt won in a landslide, right? So they were roughly saying 60-40 Landon, and it was roughly 60-40 Roosevelt. That's a big miss, like a big, big miss, even though they had 2.4 million observations. And there's two interpretations of this. And so the one that I taught for years is like I call the political science chestnut, is there was a coverage problem. And so when the Literary Digest was finding people to send their postcards to, they used, among other things, they used auto registries and phone records. And in the 1930s, people who had cars and phones were generally better off, and better off people were voting Republican. And so hence you get this bias. All right. So fair enough. So that's a thing. But the second thing, and there's more, and I kind of really go into this, and it's based on work of other people that have really dug into this, but there was, even still, it wasn't only coverage. And so there was three cities. It was Chicago, Pittsburgh, and I forget where else, but some fairly big cities where they Literary Digest folks used voter registration. It's like today, that's RBS, right? That's a nice coverage, right? Not perfect, but that's pretty darn good. It's as good as we can get these days almost. Even when they used RBS, they were getting huge bias towards Landon, right, relative to what happened in those cities. And so it suggested that there was non-ignorable non-response, right? So even if your coverage is pretty good, so you're not oversampling rich people, right, when you use RBS, right, the people who responded conditional on their covariates were running hotter towards Landon. And there's other pieces of evidence for that as well. So it's interesting. So we had big data, big miss, and we have multiple kinds of non-response bias. So then, like this, the famous part of polling, this is when polling as a science kind of emerged, was the George Gallup and Roper and some of these big names. They came in and they said, we're going to do quota sampling. And so quota sampling was to deal with the coverage issue. And they would say, we had too many rich people before. We're going to limit how many rich people, get the right amount of working class people. And they had to divide things up into segments and then try to hit those segments and then get surveys. By the way, as an aside, we kind of see quota sampling in various folks today, like just as an aside. But the quota sampling then did pretty well. It didn't do as well as the advocates said it did, but it did better than the Literary Digest, the massive data approach. But then they got it. 1948, they said Thomas Dewey, the Republican, would defeat Harry Truman. Probably the most famous picture in American politics is Harry Truman celebrating that Dewey did not, in fact, defeat Truman. And the reason people thought Dewey would win is in the polls, Dewey was ahead in the polls, consistently ahead in the polls. And then as they kind of unpacked what was going on there, right, even though they had the right percentage of people, which by the way, that sounds familiar because in a weighted sample, we have the right percent of college educated, non-college, Midwest, South, whatever the frameworks are. Even though they had those kind of marginals right, the kind of people they were getting just running too hot for Dewey, for the Republicans, right? That's where the direction, and in fact, in that era, in general polls, with the non-response bias was running favorable towards Republicans. So then, right, and these eras aren't they're smoother than this, right? They're not as cut and dry, but I think these big fiascos are like marking points when suddenly we really move on to a new era, and the new era then was random sampling. And random sampling, again, we knew about, the field knew about random sampling before this, but they weren't doing it in part because it was technically challenging, and could talk about why. But by the 50s and then on, random sampling really became the de facto standard. And it's amazing. And, folks out here know about how amazing it is, right? And let me just point out two things because it'll be relevant when we think about where we are today. One is it's unbiased, right? A random sample. You pick 1,000 people in the country, you call them, they all respond. You will get an unbiased estimate, demographics, opinions, right? Even, mental health, or, eye color, or, you name it, right? Anything. That's what a random sample is. Anything, it will be unbiased. It doesn't mean it's correct in the actual sample, but it won't be systematically high or low for any given anything you could imagine, even things you can't measure. And second property then is that accuracy depends on the sample size and not the population size. And that, for, when you've been teaching people about polls and surveys, you kind of got to beat this into people because that's a little counterintuitive, right? But a sample size of 1,000 is going to give you the same accuracy in the United States as it gives you in the state of Ohio, right? And so forth. And we're going to now, that's in the random sampling. And one of my claims is we're not in the random sampling world anymore. And so these two characteristics, we kind of got to move on. They're not baked in the way they were with random sampling. Okay. So, is random sampling over? I'll talk more about this, but like if we just use presidential polling fiascos as a marker for this, 2016, um, certainly was a shock, right? And then you can debate like polls were maybe a little better than they seemed, national polls, and Hillary Clinton, in fact, won the popular vote and so forth. But we were there. We know that based on polls, we thought Hillary Clinton would win the Electoral College. She did not. No one will forget the shock of that. And then, okay, well, let's try it again. Pretty similar kind of race, 2020 to the general public. 2020 was pretty good for polls because they said Biden would win and he won. But those, if you read the AAPOR report on 2020 and just kind of looked at the numbers, 2020 was worse, right? And that's pretty shocking because we had the warning of 2016, right? And Trump, kind of some of the special, character of polling in a Trump era, the field goes back and gets it worse, right? So there's really like, I think it's a marker for us to say like, are we doing the right things, right? Even as 2020, 2022, and 2018 are pretty good, so it's not like everything's always wrong, but those are pretty important places where we were wrong. The field more broadly was having trouble getting things right. Um, so perhaps, and then I would say, yes, it is an end of the era. It's the random sampling era. Like when exactly it is over, I don't know, but these are kind of markers for us. It's hard to continue thinking that we are in the random sampling era. So now let's talk about where we are. So that's kind of then the next part of the book is talk about where we are. And I make, the claim that random samples are dead-ish and kind of hedge it a little bit. And it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with random sampling. It's amazing. And it doesn't mean you can never get a random sample. You can sometimes, but gosh, it's getting harder, right? And it's dead-ish. Here's, for example, in political polls, from Pew, kind of documented the political response rate, in the late 90s, we're at 36% down to 6. And then I haven't seen Pew update those numbers, but New York Times and I've done some stuff like 1%. If you're doing a political survey, you're going to get 1%. That's a reasonable number. So political surveys are particularly low. There's other places where it's higher by a lot, even. So here's from an article in the Wall Street Journal. They were showing the government surveys, right? It's all like steep declines, much higher than political survey, the response rates, but still we're more and more in a world where um, the sample we get, even if we randomly contact people, because of non-response, it is just simply not the case that the data we get is a random sample, right? It probably wasn't the case even when we had 40% response rate, but maybe that's good enough, right? But when you have 1% response rate, right, it just isn't a random sample. I just don't know what else to say. It isn't. And that's to say nothing of huge part of the field has moved, doesn't even pretend or try to do random samples. So these numbers are based on the AAPOR 2020 AAPOR report. I think these were the national presidential polls or whatever. And depending on how you look at it, it's not as always as stark as this. But we're all out there in the field and we all know that. And here, internet polls, I'm using loosely as the probability-based polls. There's some definitional things there, of course. But we all see that the non-probability folks, they're just so much cheaper in their, market share, and it's just going through the roof. And the probability folks there's a few of them hanging on, but it's harder and harder. It's really, really expensive, right? And by the way, when you get a 1% response rate, is it worth the expense, right? When you're not getting a random sample anyway. I'm going to talk more about that. I'm going to strongly say it is worth the expense, right? But it's a reasonable question, certainly, whether it's worth the expense. Okay, so we don't have random sampling. We just don't, I think. And yet, what is the norm in the field, my claim or experience is that we tend to talk about things kind of as if it's a random sample, and then we hedge, right? And so I call this poll washing. And, I don't know if it's a good term or not, but I define it as the anachronistic use of the language of random sampling to imply that a poll has good properties. And what do I mean by that? So one that honestly drives me nuts is that they report the margin of error. the margin of error, like for example, the New York Times, there was a battleground poll a few months ago now. It showed Trump leading in 5 of 6 battleground polls over Joe Biden. And that was a big moment in the, kind of moving on from Joe Biden. And the New York Times had 4,000 people across 6 states. That's nice. That's a lot, right? And then you go into the details, you click around a little bit, and they report a margin of error. And they report a margin of error based on an N of 4,000. And that margin of error, like if it was a random sample, if we called 4,000 people, if we randomly picked 4,000 people, we called them, they all answered, that margin of error is scientifically like that is a meaningful concept. In fact, I suspect everyone on this call knows that of course, New York Times did not call 4,000 people. And I suspect we all know, right? They actually called 400,000 people. So 400,000 people, right? And they're reporting a margin of error as if there was no non-response, right? And I don't know what the right margin of error is, by the way, right? And maybe it doesn't mean it's infinite or, but it just that number, they're kind of using this term from random sampling in a way when they're not doing random. They're not, a 1% response rate is not a random sample, right? And we just, as a polling professional, we need to be, I think we should be, of course, wary about that. Now, New York Times will say, oh, of course, there could be other sources of error and so forth. So they do hedge it, right? But then nonetheless, they're using language and equations as if they had a 100% response rate random sample. The other one that you see a lot, especially non-probability polls, is they say, well, it's nationally representative. And meaning you look at the crosstabs after weighting and they're, whatever demographic group that they've weighted for is the right number, pretty much. And I just like, here's the example that just, it's an extreme example, but it's true, is imagine Fox News. They put a chyron, said, call this number and let us know what you think about the debate, right? They could get a 20,000 people, I don't know, they'd get a huge sample. And you reweight that, they're going to have all the demographics, right? They're going to have all the states. They're going to, you're going to get something. You can reweight that data to be in every demographic category, to be, hit some national target if you want. And no one ever, ever, ever would treat that as nationally representative in the way that a random sample is nationally representative because of the randomness. It is unbiased, and that in general, an expectation will produce something that has the right distribution of states and distributions of ages and demographics and so forth, right? So it kind of looks the same, right? And it had these nice properties in the random sampling world. It just isn't true. And I love this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time. It's from Raphael Nishimura. For the layperson, the term representative sample sounds like, a scientific term, but it's really just as vague and meaningless as saying that a sample is robust, statistically valid, or awesome, right? And it's just kind of using social sciencey type language when I don't know. I mean, maybe it's better than not being nationally representative, but it's not, it doesn't have these nice properties in expectation a random sample is nationally representative. And here we are using that term to something that's not a random sample. Sample size, you can just go on and on, but like sample size in a random sample has a very specific meaning. It's going to give us a more accurate, we're going to get the distribution is going to get tighter and tighter around an unbiased estimator. That's amazing. And it's scientifically rigorous and it really means something. In a non-random sample, I don't know what it means. And if you just want, like, remember, Literary Digest was a non-random sample. They had 2.4 million more than we ever have, I think, in general. And it's garbage, right? And that's an extreme example. But just, when we're in a non-random sample world, sample size it had a very specific meaning in a random sampling world. I don't know what it means in a non-random sampling world. And yet we kind of, because we're so trained in the random sampling world, that sounds good. There are other things, predictive accuracy and so forth, that we could talk about. But let me get to, what next? So here we are, I claim, kind of watch the history. We've landed in a place in this post-random sampling world. And, what do we do about it, right? It's kind of a bummer, right? Because we had this great scientific thing, and now it's kind of not there anymore. So what do we do about it? And so my claim is there's 2 things we should do. So the first is just appreciate the logic of non-random sampling. It's just polls have different properties. And the thing is, like, we can articulate those properties, right? I'm going to give you some pictures with some examples and two implications, right, that are different than the random sampling, two, right, things, two insights, potentially that are different than the random sampling world, right? So we can talk about polling in a non-random sampling world. We just need to talk about it differently. And by the way, just as background, I won't do it here, but in the book, I use a lot of Zhao Meng's work. He's a statistician at Harvard and has done, I think, some really cool work. And so there's some more formalization in the book. The book is readable, it's not a lot of math and so forth, but there's going to formalize this and develop this more. But here I'll just use pictures, and the logic emerges from pictures perfectly well. So let me just show you a few pictures. So here is, suppose that we have voters, we have a population. And each of those gray dots, a little hard to see, but each dot is a person. And we've plotted a scatter plot of their response interest on the x-axis and some variable of interest on the y-axis. So the response interest, the people who are at 3 on the right, they love to respond to polls, right? Like, if those of you who teach, there's the kids who raise their hand all the time. That would be the analog there. And then the folks on the left, they don't want to respond to polls. They really don't. And let's say Y is a feeling thermometer towards Kamala Harris, right? And so, high is they really like her, and low is they're not big fans. So the thing, this picture, right? It's just a picture. It's just an example. I'm not saying this is general, but just an example of a potential distribution of the response propensity, response interest, and Y might look like this. It looks a little bit like a fish. And this is ignorable non-response, because every slice, every vertical slice, you take the people around 2, right, who are pretty eager to respond. Their average, there's just people who really like Harris and people who don't like Harris. At every slice, vertical slice, the average is 50, which is also the population average. So this is ignorable non-response, right? And so response Y is not dependent on your interest in responding. The counterpart to that is non-ignorable non-response. And that we're plotting kind of a different scenario. Each dot is still a person. Now the response, the people who are really eager to respond, they're on the right, they tend to really like Harris. And the people who are not eager to respond tend not to like Harris. And by the way, this is the nightmare scenario that you read again and again and again when you read about current polls today. Like, Harris has a slight lead, but is this the case? Are the people who want to respond the pro-Harris people? And by the way, because it could go the other way. It could be we're hearing from pro-Trump people. Like, we don't know, right? But this is an example of non-ignorable non-response. Okay, so there's just a framework. And now with that, again, we have in the book, we're going to formalize this with an equation that we can kind of work through these different logics, but I want to show you 2 insights in pictures. So the first first implication is that sample size, lowercase n, and population size both matter. Again, there's an equation, and the large N is going to matter. There's going to be more bias for bigger populations. That, by the way, for those, if you're like me and you've been teaching surveys for a long time, like, it'll drive you nuts, because that's in random sampling. That's not at all true. This implication does not apply to random sampling, but for a non-random sample, it can. So here's an example. So we've got in this panel A here, we've got the tilted fish. So it's an example where there is non-ignorable non-response. The green dots are respondents. They're the people who are eager to respond. The gray dots didn't respond. And there's a bias, right? The response is running hot towards, let's say, Kamala Harris. Now imagine it's a smaller sample. It's a smaller population. So this picture, there's 20 green dots, and I don't know how, whatever, a lot more gray dots. Here we still have sample sizes fixed. Lowercase n is fixed. There's still 20 green dots. We have a very small sample, right? And we have a very small population. Just there it is in this picture, right? The bias, there's still bias in panel B, but the bias is less than there is in panel A, right? And so that's suddenly the magnitude of the bias when there is non-ignorable non-response is going to respond in part to the population size. And it's just a totally different way of thinking about it. But the thing that's relevant, I think, A, there's just that statement. And then B is that if you have some non-ignorable non-response in a big population, things can go wrong pretty fast, right? And again, like the Literary Digest is a crazy example, but there was pretty good evidence of non-ignorable non-response, and things went really wrong really fast, right? Because the bias is proportional to this really big number, which is population size. So that's one thing, right? And that's very, very different than random sampling world. The second thing is, I mean, there's more than two, but just two that I think are particularly interesting, is that even in this world, a non-random sample, random contact is still very useful. And let me make a distinction. I've already made it, but let me just be super clear. Random sample, right, is you go out, you pick 1,000 people, you randomly from the population with good coverage, and they all respond. That's a random sample, and off you go. We've got glorious, beautiful, normal distributions, and it's amazing. Random contact, random sample just isn't what we get. Random contact is feasible. And random contact is, for example, the New York Times goes out and they use voter files. And I mean, there's complexity there. Those of you kind of in the weeds there, it's not trivial, but basically they have some way to target the population and they can randomly pick people in that population. So when the New York Times called 400,000 people, they had a list of whatever millions of people. They randomly picked 400,000 who they called, emailed, however they contacted them. Um, and so they were random contact, right? So there's still randomness. And is it worth it, right? And again, like you're hearing, especially the non-probability folks say, look, you only got 1% and you're spending 10, 20, 100 times much per response, right? It's maybe it's not worth it. Well, let me show you a picture that says maybe it is worth it. So I'll go back to the picture we had before. There's tilted fish, meaning the people who want to respond are in this hypothetical scenario more favorable towards Harris. Um, Imagine though that we didn't just kind of ask everybody and get the most favorable respondents. Imagine we went through and see the darker gray dots, the filled in circles. Imagine we randomly pick people to contact, right? That's totally doable. That's what New York Times does. That's what a probability pollster does, probability based pollster does. Then we're still going to get like you contact someone who doesn't want to talk, they're not going to talk. That's just the reality. And you contact someone who wants to talk, they're going to talk, right? But you get less. You've converted and then in the book, I talk about this, you've converted like the magnitude of bias from being something proportional to population, which was the previous pictures I showed on the previous slides, to now it's proportional to non-response rate. Still a problem, right? You're still biased, but you've limited, you've reduced, you've cabined the non-response bias. And so that's pretty powerful. Okay, so the second thing, try to keep moving a little quickly here. So the first point is like, okay, we're in a post non-random sampling world. We should recognize this, and then there's different language to talk about what we're doing and some different insights. Second point is there are actually things we can do. So I'm just going to tell you a story, like a hypothetical story, which I hope gets at the intuition, and then I'll show you briefly an example of using this kind of logic. So the example, like I'm a teacher, and so I think of this, but I suspect you've either been teaching or a student, and I hope this will be familiar to you. So imagine you've got 100 kids in your class, right? So I'm teaching, I've got 100 kids, and I do this all the time. I ask some question, some question about, well, what is the expected value of X in a random sampler? I ask some question. And just to kind of keep the conversation going, people opt in and they choose to respond. And on the left here, imagine I only get like a 1% response rate. And now imagine instead of them talking in class, we have them write it down so we can, but we ask, hey, who knows the answer to this question? And the first 2 or 3 kids to raise their hands, to volunteer to talk, they're usually pretty good, right? They're not 100%, but the whole reason they raise their hand is because they think they know the answer, and they're usually pretty good. But if we went to 10%, we're going to start to move, right? The probability they get it right is lower and lower. And let's imagine it's just in the class, actually 50% of the kids know the answer, 50% don't. But, right, we've all been there. The first 2 kids who raise their hands have a heck of a lot more higher probability of getting the right answer than, if we went all the way to 100, right? Now, imagine, sorry. Imagine I did a random sample. Like I just randomly sample kids and I kind of make them answer, like draw names out of a hat and then they go off and they write down the answer or whatever. Like in expectation, a random sample, we know random sample, the true proportion is 50%. The expected value will be 50%. Of course, there'll be sampling variation. I'm not doing that in this picture. But the thing to appreciate is notice there's a difference here. So if I get 10% responding in the non-random sample world, I'm getting a ton of people right. And in the random sample people, I'm getting 50%. Now I jack up the percentage of people who I get the answers for. In the non-random sampling world, it's going to still be higher than 50%, but it's going to be lower than when we only had 10%, right? And so here's the thing. So those like missing at random or ignorable non-response treats things as effectively a random sample, right? And yet we want to know if it really is a non-random sample, we want to know this. And so the logic is, imagine I have two classrooms. They're both 100 people for simplicity. In one of them, I go and I get a 10% response rate. And the other one, I go and I get a 20% response rate, right? If, and I let people raise their hands, right? If in both those two classrooms, I'm getting the same number, it's effectively random, right? It's ignorable, right? But if when I have 10% response rate, the proportion who get it right, or in a political survey, the proportion who say they like Kamala Harris is different than when I have a 30% response rate. That's consistent with this blue line, right? That we have a non-random sample. That's a way to diagnose not only if we have this non-randomness, this non-ignorability, but the magnitude of it, right? And so that's the basic idea. And so let me just show you a picture here. Imagine now we've got our fish. We get, 20 responses here. And then we do a separate group, right? We've divided the population. One, we do a survey where we're only getting a 10% response rate. And another, we do a survey where we're getting a 30% response rate. For example, you could just try harder in the bottom panel, or maybe you pay people to respond. And by the way, there's issues there. I appreciate that, right? But we go from a 10% response rate in half the population to a 30% response rate. If it's ignorable, we're going to get the same, there's sampling error, but we're going to get the same mean in expectation. If it's not ignorable, when we have the small response rate, we get a high a number, and we're going to get, as the response rate gets bigger, we're going to get a lower and lower number, right? And in theory, if we went all the way to 100%, right, we'd get the right number, but it would get lower and lower. So that's like the hook is what we're going to try to do, is try to have, not, we're going to randomly contact, like the ideal form here, you randomly contact people. Half of them, you do what you always do. If it's a political poll, you're going to get a 1% response rate. But for half of them, you do something to get a 2, 3, 4, 5% or 10, 20, whatever. You get a higher response rate, and you compare the differences across those things. Those of you may have seen New York Times did exactly this in 2022 for Wisconsin. They did a subset in Wisconsin. And it was very, very interesting. And they didn't use this logic or, talk about it the way I talked about it, but they did exactly, that's the kind of thing I would do. Then I would analyze it slightly different than what they did. Not even that wildly differently than what they did. So now let me give you a quick example, and then I'm eager to hear questions. So I did a survey in 2019. I did a survey where basically people came in. It's an online survey. It was with Ipsos with their knowledge panel. What I did was I said, hey, the first question was, do you want to talk about politics? Here's the question. Do you want to talk about politics, sports, health, or movies? If you chose politics, I'd ask you politics questions. If you chose movies, I'd ask you movies questions. By the way, later I'd ask you politics questions. So a little bit of, that. And so what we would do then is, sorry, half the people I would just ask politics straight up, right? So that's a pretty high response. The other half, I would allow them to basically leave the room. So if you chose politics, given you had 4 choices, you're a pretty eager response. You're really eager to talk about politics. And now turnout is a classic thing where it's hard to poll because we worry about a number of things, but one of them is non-ignorable non-response. So of the people who were treated and chose politics, so that means I said, hey, you can leave, you can talk about movies and sports or whatever, but they stuck around and talked about politics. Is it like 85? Some huge proportion of them said they were certainly going to vote. Of the people who were given no choice, I just asked them, right? So that's kind of the analog to the high response group that we had earlier. They were, clearly less, it's still high, but 72 or something percent, right? Like you can just see a very clear difference. Of the people who chose movies or sports or health, right? Remember later on, I went back and asked them about what they thought. They were even lower. They're in the 60s, right? So we see this like pattern of how eager you are to respond is associated with your response about whether you're going to turn out. So again, in the book, I go through this and in other papers, but just like the observed sample, we had a 77% proportion of people said they're certainly going to vote. And that the next option was likely vote or something, right? You do weights, it changed it a little bit, but not much. And then you do the analysis that's in the spirit of what I'm talking about here. The proportion went down by a lot, right? So that's interesting. And the last thing I'll talk about is just give you an example of Trump approval. So we did again, we had basically we're going to have some people are allowed to leave the room and not, leave the survey and not talk about politics. Other people, we just ask about politics right away. And it turned out, like in terms of doing these analyses for the whole population, we didn't see any bias one way or the other. So this is the parameter on whether there's non-ignorable non-response. In the whole population, there was no bias. But among Democrats, there was a strong negative bias. Of the Democrats who chose politics, they were much more negative than the Democrats who we just started asking about politics, right? So the people who really wanted to talk about politics of the Democrats really didn't like Trump relative to the people who we didn't force them, but they were, they didn't have the opportunity to leave the survey. Republicans went the other way. Of the Republicans who wanted to talk about politics, they were very favorable towards Trump relative to Republicans who we just asked about politics. So that those two things balance out. There's roughly the same number of Democrats and Republicans. So in the whole population, we're kind of getting it right, right. But that's important. I think that we're getting differences there. And then the last one I'll just show you here is in the Midwest. We focused just on the Midwest. It looked a little bit like the Democrats. So of the Midwesterners who wanted to talk about politics, they were substantially more negative towards Trump than the Midwesterners who we just asked about politics right away. And the implication is, and again, I talk about this in the book, is when you take this into account, like the raw and even the weighted data had Trump approval at 40% in the Midwest in 2019. But you do carry this logic forward, it ended up the predicted Trump approval was 50%. And that's different, right? And where was he? But Trump was doing pretty well in the Midwest even in 2020, right? And so is that the right number? I don't know. But is it a diagnostic that there might be something wrong and we should really look more carefully at what's happening in the Midwest? That's my claim. Is that something we should do? So anyway, lots more to talk about, lots of other stuff, but I'm eager to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. We're now open for questions. Feel free to turn on your camera if you're comfortable, or you can raise your hand if you want to speak, and I can call on you so we don't talk over each other. Make sure you start with your name and affiliation before asking a question or contributing to the discussion. Maybe I'll kick us off a little bit here, right? Okay. So I thought this was really fascinating, and I thought you did a really great job of talking through some complexities in terms of selecting samples and well, and thinking through biases in that process, right? But I found myself thinking, boy, is it hard to disentangle actual differences in response over time versus differences due to this non-ignorable non-response. And I wondered if you could talk about that, about the sort of shifting sands of what you're measuring in the first place and how that relates to this critique of random sampling.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I think part of that also is just, like how feasible is it to try to get at these things. And so the, like there's layers of how I would think about it. And so first, what I really want to do, and I think is like the quite firm ground, is just we are post-random sample, and we just need to sit down and look at like where are we and what would it look like for us to do something that would get at non-ignorable non-response. By the way, there are other places where the errors can come in, right? I'm not saying it's the only case, but I think this is like a big one. And if you read the 2020 AAPOR report, they kind of land on that this is one of the bigger ones that's still out there. Um, so, how are we really, as a practical matter, going to get at this? Like the things, like again, like where you split the sample. So you go in, you randomly contact people, and you split the sample, and some of them get intensive efforts, whether it's money or more efforts or something, and some of them just get the same old, or even maybe you lighten up, you do a little less than you would, but you're getting like like a in the same old, you're really getting those people. You're getting 1% of the respondents, from, for example, from the New York Times. But those folks really want to talk about politics. They're weird. They're just by definition, they are, right? They're one percenters, right? So you get those. And then you look at the other side of the world where you're getting a two percenters or three percenters. And now if they're different, that's a sign. Now the thing is, like, can you see, like in my tilted fish and those different stories, like we really don't know. Well, does you see a difference from the one percenters to the two percenters to the three percenters? Well, what about the 50 and 60 and 70%? And we just don't know. And so that would be an assumption that there's some kind of continuity there. And so, we'd want to be cautious about extrapolating beyond that. But if there's a difference, and like in the things I did, I would see a clear difference. Like turnout, everything I've done every single time has a pattern that I saw, that like you go from the people who really want to respond, they all vote. The people who kind of don't, where there's a lower response propensity, they're less likely to vote. It happens every single time, always. And so can I absolutely get the right slope of that? Maybe not, but there is a slope. It's not flat. It's not ignorable. Um, so, I think that we can do stuff. And that stuff isn't impossible. And I'd love to see, like, again, we're seeing so many times in the New York Times and everyone else, they'll say, oh, but maybe polls are wrong. Maybe, but then like, well, why don't you sit down and think about what would be evidence that these polls are or are not, you know, wrong? And just that, at least in our limited way, some of these tools, like literally the New York Times has done it in the past. Probably every pollster out there at some point has done something where they try to increase response rates. And if they've done something that increases response rates and they're successful, then what I'm talking about is really easy, actually, right? And they could at least get a diagnostic to help them get at it. So, is this like a solved problem? No, absolutely not. But it's like, I think there's a direction. And I think we've just got the field has gotten a little too comfortable just in saying, well, random sampling is amazing. We use weighting and it looks like a random sample to a layperson. But we got to tell lay people that these kind of are terrible, right? Because we don't know, right? And that's like fine. And as a practical matter, that's all we got. But I think we can do more.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll share. I don't have a lot of experience in the polling space. I work more in production of official statistics, right? And one of the things that kind of always takes my breath away is how fast polling moves. And so when we talk about doing things like split ballots or like split efforts in contact, I think, ooh, is there a timeline, right, with the fast pace of how quick polling moves, where we could implement something like that, where that method would be, viable?
Yeah. And by like in the government space, like I've seen, like there's really interesting stuff like on unemployment. I've seen people do, this was in Europe, but they did in this case they had administrative records. So they knew whether people were employed or not. Like they just knew. But then they wanted to get like opinions and experience with the government and so forth. So they did a survey. But meanwhile, they kind of knew some baseline things in a way that's wouldn't know typically in politics. And they just saw like really marked, like, the kind of people who responded. And I forget which way the bias went, but I think was it the unemployed people were much less likely to respond, or, so like you would just see these response bias, even controlling for gender and region and occupation. And, they could just see this stuff. So when you get an 80% response rate, like, actually going back to what I was talking about earlier, if you have an 80% response rate, the error is proportional in a non-random sample, the error is proportional to the non-response rate. Non-response rate is 20%. There's a problem, but it's small. But now you're getting a 40% response rate and a 60% non-response rate. You've just tripled, or whatever the right number is, right? But suddenly, and so I think even the government statistics, they have, as a political polling person, I'm so jealous of government statistic response rates, but those things are going down and they're going down fast. And I think these issues are relevant there as well.
Matt, did you want to contribute?
Yeah. Um, Thanks for the talk. I enjoyed the book, Michael. I'm Matt Strauss. I lead survey research at i360. Um, in terms of the solutions phase of the book, you kind of have the two phases, one on building in sort of randomization into actual survey instruments, and then a whole sort of section on more modeling based approaches. Um, how do you put weight between those two buckets? What have you seen working so far? As somebody who's read your book and done a lot of experimentation with their own polling work, per your book, the modeling stuff is complex, and so how do you think about those two sort of buckets of proposed solutions?
Yeah, by the way, I'd love to hear, offline or whatever, hear your experience of what you're saying. But so my like so again, and I didn't talk about it in this talk, so I'll just set a little background. So there's non-ignorable non-response. It's easy in quotes, but it's really not that hard to write down what that would look like. Write down a model. There's a response equation and an outcome equation, and we can write down like in fairly general terms of what that would look like. And then there's two approaches, like you said, and one that I didn't talk about here is you can really go and try to formalize that equation in a kind of really mathematical and statistical sense and copulas and there's all these kind of mathematical things that get pretty hairy pretty fast.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is what I emphasized here is you can do a response instrument is the language I use in the book, but is you can kind of rate, you have these two groups that I talked about. And my experience in it's fairly limited, but I've done this a fair bit, right? Is again and again like the mathematical crazy stuff, right? You're gonna get you do like the when you try to model it out in that more mathematical statistical sense with the copulas and Heckman and all these permutations of that kind of thing. As long as you have a response instrument, you get pretty much the same. It points you in the same direction and gives you pretty much the same magnitude, whatever your model is. And at that point, I would then use the simpler models. And the simpler models are off the shelf statistical packages. We can run those things, right? And then if you're really kind of you love it, or you're nervous about stuff, you can do some robustness checks of that. But I think the key is you need what it's in the statistical jargon here would be a response instrument. You need something that's going to distinguish some people are in the group where lots of people are responding and other people are in a group where not many people are responding, right? And that's where the energy and the action is. That's my strong experience and the experience of other. There's I have sites to other people have had. They don't say it exactly that way, but if you dig in there a little bit, you see the same. They've come to the same conclusion.
Yeah. Do you think there's utility still in the non-prob world, right? We see most pollsters, academics, just full-throated synth everything. Do you think there's applicability in the non-prob space to some of these ideas? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's harder. Like everything in non-probability is harder. We all, that's it's just hard to get the ground truth and so forth. But even there, like imagine you're in your non-probability world. So you've gone and you're kind of getting people in, right? So they're in your like a classic non-probability panel. It's not, some non-probability is not panel, but imagine you have a panel. So you've enrolled people and it's pop-up ads and God knows what, right? But even in that, now of the people who are enrolled, one sample you just hit them with regular what you always do, and the other sample you go after them hard because even a non-probability panel, not everyone responds. You get a much higher than 1% response rate. I think it's 40-50 is pretty common in a panel, although I don't know, that varies probably, but you still could do this logic, and now it's conditional on that they responded at all to get in your panel in the first place, and that's a place for us to be cautious about what happened there. But still, you could at least say, like, among this set of people, there's people who want to talk about politics and there's people who don't. And the people who want to talk about politics, are they the same as the people who don't? And just for example, I did with a company called Verisign, I was doing some questions and they're non-probability, and I really don't know how they got their sample, but I would do this thing. And this is when it was Trump Biden, and it was the of the people who wanted to talk about politics, right? Who were choosing politics, they were really pro-Trump relative to the people who weren't choosing politics. And so that was flipping, the classic thing in 2016 and 2020 was the people who wanted to talk about politics were the pro Clinton or pro Biden. And when it was Trump Biden, it had flipped. I haven't done the analysis. I suspect now it's probably leveled out, right, with Trump Harris. But there was that. And so that was a non-probability world, and it was a diagnostic. I wouldn't say that I got the right number out of it, but there's other cases and there's other questions where I wouldn't see those differences even in a non-probability world.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right, this has been terrific. Thank you so much again for your time. Uh, and for joining us today and participating in this series, and to all of you for for making it a success. So I'm going to go ahead and close us out now, being mindful of time. So as promised, the DC-AAPOR member that has won a copy of today's book is Georgina Pizzolito. Man, I practiced and everything and I still stumbled. I'll reach out to you and get your address and send you a copy of the book in the next couple of days. Congratulations. I just want to bring a few things up. Our next big event is the 2024 DC-AAPOR WSS Review Preview Conference on Tuesday, September 24th at the National Academies of Sciences. Registration is still open, and it not only gets you access to all of the presentations, but also breakfast and 2 drinks at the post-conference happy hour. Reach out if you need some more information. There's also information on the DC-AAPOR website. On October 16th, we're going to be sponsoring a webinar on diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility with keynote speaker, Census Bureau Director Rob Santos. More information will be sent out later this month. Keep your eyes open for that one. It's going to be pretty hot. And as a heads up, in November, your DC-AAPOR will be hosting a panel with the Roper Center in celebration of their annual Mitofsky Award. Mark your calendars for Thursday, November 14th, again with more details to come. Keep your eyes open. But otherwise, thank you everyone for coming and cheers to a great afternoon. Thanks again, Michael, for your time.
All right. Thank you. That was really great. Thank you.
All right.